Hello, I'm John Terry, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking to Tim Wright, who leads our asset management reward practice, about the remuneration regulations and how they impact in the investment management industry. Hello, Tim.
Hi, John.
Tim, most recently, at the end of December last year, the European Banking Authority, the EBA, finalised its remuneration guidelines. And of course, certain investment management houses are impacted by that. And critically, a few weeks ago, the UK regulators decided to what extent they're going to comply or not. Why is that so important to the investment management industry and how they're impacted?
To really understand how they impact this industry, John, you need to take a step back and look at whether or not, as an investment management business, you're in scope of CRD4, the latest iteration of the Capital Requirements Directive. And that's not a straightforward question to answer. You need to look at your own corporate structure and how you're put together as a business, and also your permissions with the regulator. Once you've gone through that exercise and you know you're in scope of that directive, then the guidelines become very important. Until now, regulators have treated investment management firms, whether or not they're in scope of CRD4 or not, in a very similar way. If you're subject to the guidelines, though, they're very clear. You cannot disapply any of the requirements of the directive for an investment management firm in scope of CRD4. So going forward from 2017, firms will need to comply as a minimum with the requirements of that directive.
And wasn't it the case, Tim, that the UK regulator decided to ignore one aspect of those guidelines?
Yes, so one of the most worrying provisions for businesses is this concept of the bonus cap. And interestingly, the UK regulator came out and said, we will comply with all of these guidelines with the exception of applying that bonus cap to the asset management industry. That's not necessarily the end of the story, though, because it's only one of a series of provisions that these firms will now need to deal with. And also, it's a UK position, so we need to also monitor what's going on in other territories as well.
So they may well apply to their European operations outside the UK, they may well have the bonus cap, but the other types of the regulations, including material risk taker identification, they are included.
Absolutely.
Okay, so much to do. But there's many more regulations apart from that. What are the big ones that really impact organisations?
So there are three other main EU directives really that apply to the industry in terms of remuneration rules and requirements. The first is AIFMD. AIFMD has been effective now for a number of years. So firms will already have taken action to become compliant with that, although that won't yet have been tested by the regulator. The second is UCITS 5, and UCITS 5 is a very topical issue at the moment, having come into effect just a few weeks ago, and therefore firms are now really focusing and prioritising their time to get to grips with the requirements of that directive and what it might mean for them going forward. The final one is MiFID 2, which is some way off yet, but shouldn't be ignored because it will have quite a major impact on how sales professionals in the industry will be remunerated as well.
So with all these regulations, what do firms need to do now?
So thinking through each of those directives in turn, CRD4 and the EBA guidelines really focus on your material risk taker population. Make sure you have that right, because you have to do that anyway. And it will be tested and scrutinised by the regulators who see it as a bit of a priority for themselves. On UCITS 5, we don't yet have final ESMA guidance, but unfortunately we have no more time to wait. So firms really need to start preparing for the implementation of the requirements for that directive in the absence of that guidance. Finally, on AFMD, all of these decisions have been taken so far. Firms are now complying to the extent they think they are. However, scrutiny will be coming from the regulator. So being prepared for that scrutiny is another one to watch out for.
And presumably, Tim, some consistency in the way in which an organisation applies some similar rules across those regulations is pretty important.
Absolutely.
So quite a lot for the regulators to focus on with investment management houses, and therefore a lot for them to get their act in order.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's great. So clearly, there are significant changes in the way in which impacted firms are planning ahead is absolutely critical. Thank you, Tim, and thank you very much for listening.